Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Digby Ricci. Welcome to another lecture in our series, Brushing Up the Bard. We continue our exploration of the Merchant of Venice, and this is the second lecture in that particular series. When we left off last time, we were exploring the character of Bassanio. Bassanio's fortune-hunting element is disturbingly emphasized by Shakespeare from the outset. Bassanio describes Portia's golden hair, she is obviously a dazzling blonde beauty, as resembling a golden fleece. And this allusion to the myth of Jason and his quest for the golden fleece definitely alerts the reader to what Moody has called the pervasive irony of the play. Firstly, mentioning Portia as a treasure has a rather distasteful, avaricious quality to it. And secondly, funded by his overindulgent friend Antonio, Bassanio hardly has to display the courage of the seafaring Jason, who with his Argonauts survived many perils before they reached the island of Colchis, and assisted by the magical powers of the sorceress Princess Medea, who became immediately infatuated with Jason, the Argonauts were able to gain the fleece and return to Jason's homeland. The ironies are rich here. Firstly, Bassanio definitely regards Portia as a prize, first and foremost, a financial prize. And secondly, it is already skillfully and subtly suggested that Bassanio will be assisted by the highly intelligent Portia to gain his desires, just as Jason was assisted by the witch princess Medea. Bassanio's self-regard, greed, and manipulation of his doting friend Antonio are very troubling for the reader. Harold C. Goddard is not over harsh when he says that Bassanio's appeal to Antonio to lend him more money could best be summed up as follows. I quote, "Lend me a little more money to make love to a lady who has inherited a fortune and has beauty and virtue, and with good luck I will repay you out of her wealth, both your new loan and your old ones." This is not exactly the key of Romeo and Juliet, unquote. I, in fact, agree 100% with Goddard's dryly disparaging assessment. Bassanio is no fairy tale hero, no noble adventurer, but a glamorous fortune hunter whose eye-catching allure is funded by his friend and whose desperation to repair his disabled estate and fortune makes him enter the competition for Portia's hand in the first place. Shakespeare is certainly not endorsing romantic cliches in The Merchant of Venice. Rather, he is puncturing them and looking at the complex mixture of motives, often very impure, that are present in all human actions, including romantic relationships. Many readers, viewers, and critics wonder why Antonio is so generous to Bassanio. Some insist that Shakespeare suggests that Antonio cherishes a sorrowful, unrequited homosexual love for Bassanio. The actor David Bamber, in fact, played Antonio in this way in Trevor Nunn's very interesting 1999 production. However, the homoerotic element in the text, if you believe it is there, is certainly not explicit. What Shakespeare does focus on and condemn is the excess of Antonio's commitment to Bassanio, whatever its motives. We might regard Antonio as acting as an overgenerous, indulgent parent figure to Bassanio, but nevertheless, the feelings are irrational, foolish, and even self-destructive. Antonio panders to Bassanio's mercenary nature, and this pandering will prove very dangerous for him, Antonio. Antonio does not have enough ready money to provide Bassanio with the 3,000 ducats. It is a large sum of money that Bassanio requires to strut his stuff before the heiress of Belmont. So Antonio breaks his own rule and approaches a moneylender or usurer. It is important to remember that in medieval times and in the Renaissance, usury was condemned by the Christian church as an unnatural way of making money. Human beings were meant to profit through their own labors by the sweat of their brows. And when you lend out money at interest, you in a sense make base metal breed in an unnatural way. In medieval and Renaissance Venice, in which Venetian Jews were confined to a ghetto, and we in fact get the term ghetto from Venice, and were not permitted to practice certain professions, money lending almost inevitably became an outlet for a persecuted and restricted race. Many Jewish Venetians, therefore, became moneylenders or usurers. Shakespeare would certainly have had this fact in mind when he looks very critically at the double standards of a merchant like Antonio. Antonio deplores usury, and yet he goes to a moneylender, a usurer, when he feels it suits his purposes, to satisfy the needs of his prodigal friend, Bassanio. It would appear that supposed moral principles are very flexible, even elastic, among the Venetian Christians. And then we are introduced to the usurer, Shylock, and we are immediately struck by how cautious and meticulous Shylock's speech is. He carefully repeats the terms of the deal that Bassanio is offering, as if in fact he is clinging to facts as a kind of protection in an insecure world of persecution and injustice. The enmity between the Jewish usurer and the Venetian Christians is immediately emphasized. Shylock declares in an aside that he hates Antonio because he is a Christian. And at first this hatred seems simply to be an expression of bigotry, irrational prejudice. However, we soon discover what it means to be a Venetian Christian in relation to Shylock. Shylock points out that Antonio constantly mocks his well-won thrift, by which Shylock means his carefully arranged and successful business dealings. Thrift in the play means business and is actually very abusive to Shylock himself. We await justification of Shylock's statement, and it soon comes. Shylock's pride in his heritage is emphasized, and also his knowledge of his faith. He uses biblical examples to counter Antonio's hatred of usury, and he points out that often actions which might be regarded as sharp practice by human beings are actually endorsed by God himself. He cites an example from Genesis, a very famous one, the story of how Rebekah, Jacob's wise mother, intrigued on his behalf. Rebekah was determined that Jacob should gain the inheritance intended for his brother Esau. And in order to ensure this, she took the skins of kids and she placed them on the arms, hands, and the smooth part of the neck of Jacob, so that Jacob's blind father Isaac, when he used a kind of braille test to check that the right son was approaching him, would be deceived. Esau was very hirsute, which means very hairy, and therefore the trick with the skins of the kids certainly worked. And Jacob received the inheritance that was intended for Esau. but Jacob had been chosen by God as the third possessor, the third great patriarch. And therefore, what sounds to us like Rebekah's rather dubious deception was serving God's greater purpose. The Geneva Bible, used by Shakespeare, an English translation of the Bible that preceded the famous King James translation by 51 years, speaks of Rebekah's subtlety. And subtlety there means skillful deception. Shylock also cites the example of Jacob's behavior as far as Laban, his father-in-law, was concerned, in the whole rather mysterious matter of Laban's sheep. Jacob was serving Laban at the time, and Laban promised to remunerate him by giving him the lambs that were flecked and spotted. Laban obviously thought that he was deceiving Jacob and that there would be very few such lambs. By a strange feat of what sounds to us like genetic engineering, Jacob uses stripped and peeled branches, displaying them almost as a fence before the copulating sheep, to ensure that when breeding time comes round, the ewes give birth to many pied and spotted lambs, and thus he gains considerable rewards. Again, this is an example of subtlety, to quote the Geneva Bible's terms, that was endorsed by God. Jacob is the chosen one, and such deception is justified. So, Shylock suggests that one should not judge too quickly, too superficially, and too harshly. What is one person's deception might be another person's skillful piece of business. And what do human beings know anyway about what the Almighty endorses? It is a very interesting, knowledgeable, and carefully justified argument. And it disturbs us that Antonio does not attempt to counter it in any meaningful way. He offers no examples of his own, no theological argument. He simply resorts to what we call the ad hominem attack, the attack on the human being. He denounces Shylock as being like the devil who is citing scripture for his own purposes. In a very memorable outburst of understandably bitter mockery, Shylock pours scorn on the fact that Antonio has approached him for assistance at all. He says that Antonio has abused him both verbally and physically. Antonio has called him a cur and a dog, and has even spat upon his traditional Jewish robe, his Jewish gabardine. It startles the reader that Antonio makes no attempt to deny Shylock's charges. On the contrary, he boasts, and he says, "I will abuse you again. I will call you dog again. And if you are going to agree to this deal, lend me the money not as a friend, but as a foe, as an enemy." And thus the merry bond comes into being. It is true that Shylock is motivated by a desire for revenge. He is angry, and justifiably so. How can the Venetian Christians approach him, asking him to assist them, and continue to regard him as an inferior, as no better than a beast, a mongrel, who should be spurned whenever they have the opportunity to spurn him? However, it could also be said that by entering into this bond, Shylock is perhaps attempting to gain at least some respect from the Venetian Christians. This is never a simplified play, and motives are very mixed indeed. On the one hand, Shylock may wish to have his enemy on the hip, as he puts it, but on the other hand, he might wish to impress the Venetian Christians, who are always so scornfully judgmental and dismissive of him. And so the merry bond is created. The pound of flesh, if Antonio is not able to repay the loan. And a pound of flesh, as Shylock points out, is worth very little. Who would want human flesh after all? Antonia is only too ready to enter into the deal. Bassanio is somewhat more cynical and wary, but nevertheless, they do agree. Jew and Christians agree on this particular deal. And some critics have pointed out that is very interesting symbolically, and I like this point, that it appears that Shylock wishes to gain literally what the Christians are not prepared to give him emotionally. The pound of flesh, after all, if it comes to be cut off at all, will be cut off nearest to the heart. In a sense, Shylock maybe is attempting to gain literally what the Christians always deny him emotionally, their hearts. Despite some critics' opposing views, the world of Portia's Belmont is not really elevated above the greed and malice of Venetian money-making. Antonia is not alone in his prejudiced attitudes. When she discusses the suitors who have tried to gain her hand, Portia dismisses them with acerbic wit in very stereotyped terms. There is the over-excitable, dramatic Frenchman, the Englishman who dresses badly and knows no foreign languages, the drunken German, and so on. Portia's wit is scathing, and we do laugh with her, but we are also rather uneasy because Shakespeare very skillfully does not allow us to see these suitors at all. In a sense, we have only Portia's word for the descriptions of them, and we do not know whether she is being just at all. There is genuine spite in her witty dismissals, and her glib sweeping aside of the newly arrived Prince of Morocco disturbs the reader most. If he is a virtuous but unattractive man, she says, let him be my confessor, but not my husband. We must note then that Portia judges by appearance as much as the other hedonistic and greedy Venetian Christians do. The casket subplot of The Merchant of Venice needs to be discussed in somewhat more detail. Many commentators are altogether too sympathetic to Portia, deploring the fact that she is imprisoned by the terms of her father's will. This is to an extent true, but it must be emphasized that the will is, of course, very harsh on the suitors. All suitors have to swear that if they choose unsuccessfully, they will never woo another woman again. It is a very, very harsh requirement indeed. Also, since Portia is presented to us as a woman of such sharp wit, we feel that she will find a way to get round the terms of her father's will. She will be able to find a loophole. The Prince of Morocco is a fascinating figure in the play. He is described as a tawny Moor, all in white. He is often mistakenly presented by directors as a braggart and a shallow, greedy man. There is no justification for such a presentation in the actual text. The Prince of Morocco's opening line to Portia is very moving. It is a plea to her not to judge him by his appearance, a plea to her to put aside prejudice. Mislike me not for my complexion, lady, he says. Do not dismiss me because of my dark skin and my appearance. Certainly, he praises himself to an extent, but then he is trying to woo Portia, to win her love. He speaks of his heroism, his martial prowess, and his stature within his own nation. This seems to me completely justifiable if one is wooing somebody, and desiring to make the best possible impression. And when he chooses wrongly the golden casket, he does not choose it out of greed and simply respect for appearance, the glitter of gold. He chooses it out of mistaken idealism. He has elevated and glorified Porsche. He sees her as a living, breathing saint, an angelic figure whose beauty and virtue are such that they can be enclosed only in gold. Gold is the only metal appropriate to make a container of Porsche's portrait. And therefore he chooses the golden casket, because only gold is suited to such a glorious and virtuous figure. He is mistaken, and the warning about all that glisters is not gold is given to him. But I agree with those critics who point out that in a sense the criticism is directed more at Porsche. She is the golden casket, glittering beautiful on the outside, but there isn't the spiritual gold of compassion within. And her brisk dismissal of the unsuccessful Prince of Morocco certainly confirms the point that I've just made. She says sharply and swiftly, "A gentle riddance, draw the curtains, go. Let all of his complexion choose me so." And there is a horrible ring of prejudice and malice about that dismissal. The departure of the, for me, noble Prince of Morocco would seem to be a suitable place at which to end this lecture on the Merchant of Venice. And I hope you will join me again when we continue our exploration of this very complex and troubling play.